If you've tried fresh milled flour and thought, why does this feel harder? This video will explain everything. So many women switch to fresh milled flour expecting it to behave exactly like store-bought flour. And when it doesn't, they assume that they're doing something wrong. You're not. Fresh milled flour is different, and once you understand how it behaves, baking actually becomes simpler, not harder. In this video, I'm going to walk you through what changes in texture, hydration, and fermentation, and even flavor, so that you know exactly what to expect. All right, so let's talk about some differences that you'll notice right away: the texture and the hydration. Fresh milled flour contains the entire grain, including the bran and the germ, and that changes how it absorbs water. Whole grain flour absorbs significantly more liquid than refined all-purpose flour. So if you swap it out one for one and you expect the dough to feel the same, it's not. It will often feel thicker, it's going to be slightly drier or heavier at first. This is because the bran acts almost like a sponge. It continues absorbing moisture even after you've mixed the dough. This is why autolyse becomes incredibly important with fresh milled flour. P.S. Autolyse is just a fancy word for the period of time where you let your flour and your water rest. So when I'm making bread, I'll almost always let my dough rest for about 45 minutes after mixing the flour and the water. That rest period allows the bran to fully hydrate and soften before I begin to evaluate the dough. And here's something else. Don't be afraid to adjust mid-loaf. So if your dough feels too tight or dry after resting, then just add water slowly. Maybe just like a tablespoon at a time, and mix it gently, and then you can feel the difference. Fresh milled baking is actually less about rigid measurements and more about learning the feel of your dough. So if you're working with a living whole ingredient like fresh milled grain, it requires just a little more observation, and that's not a flaw, it's just part of the process. Fresh milled flour also changes fermentation, and this is where many people get confused. Because the full grain is present, your starter has more nutrients that are available. It has more food, and there will be more activity. So, for example, when I feed my starter with fresh milled flour, it's often ready in about 4 hours. When I use all-purpose flour, it typically takes 6 hours or more. So that's a noticeable difference. When I'm baking bread, I've also found that I need less overall fermentation time after my stretch and folds. So that's something important that you need to think about. And here's something else that's important, is that my dough actually doesn't double in size. If you're waiting for a full 100% rise like you might have with white flour dough, then you might accidentally end up overproofing your dough. So with fresh milled flour, I usually see about a 30% increase in size. And what I'm really looking for is this: a slightly domed top. The dough looks airy and it feels lighter, but it's not dramatically doubled. Fresh milled flour is not nearly as dramatic as all-purpose flour. So when you feed your starter with fresh milled flour, you're not going to see that full double and bubble where it may actually come out of the jar. You won't see that. It's not as dramatic when you're baking bread with it. You won't see as much of a rise in your bread. And then, like I said, you won't get that 100% rise in your dough that lets you know that it's time. You really, like I said, you're just looking for that 30% increase in size. You really want to look at more of the visual cues instead of the clock, because fresh milled flour just moves differently. So instead of chasing timelines, you're going to want to start watching the dough itself. That shift alone prevents a lot of frustration. And I go more in depth on all of this in my fresh milled flour sourdough course, so you can find the link in the description below. The final difference that I find with fresh milled flour over all-purpose is actually the flavor and the structure. So fresh milled flour includes every part of the wheat berry, and because of that, it's naturally heavier than an all-purpose flour. So you might notice fewer large air pockets, your crumb is going to be tighter, and a more substantial texture in the bread, and that's completely normal. If you're expecting giant open bakery style holes that you see in your regular white sourdough loaves, then you might feel disappointed at first. But remember, you're not baking with refined flour anymore. You're baking with the entire grain, and that means a couple of different things. And this just means that your bread is going to be more filling, it's going to be more nutrient dense, and more grounded in whole food. So the texture will not be identical to all-purpose flour. The flavor will actually be deeper, and the crumb that you will see will actually be more hearty. So once you adjust your expectations and you stop trying to force fresh milled flour to behave like something that it isn't, you'll embrace it for what it is. It's nourishing, it's complete, and it's real. So if you've been struggling with dense loaves, overproof dough, or recipes that just don't feel right after switching to fresh milled flour, please don't quit. You just need the right adjustment. So this is exactly why I created my free fresh milled flour conversion guide. So it shows you exactly how to adjust hydration correctly, to use autolyse effectively, to know when fermentation is actually done, and to confidently convert your favorite recipes without guessing. So you can take your favorite all-purpose flour recipes and convert them to fresh milled flour using these methods in my free conversion guide. So just remember that fresh milled flour isn't harder, it's actually just different. And you can grab that free guide below and start baking with confidence instead of frustration. And once you understand these shifts, everything starts to click.